I'm Dana Bray. I'm the legal director of the Law, Environment, and Animals program at Yale Law School, where I lead a project that explores the potential for U.S. court litigation to address the climate harms of industrial animal agriculture. And we chose to focus that project on litigation because it's an immediately available tool, a legal tool that we can use to seek to address the harms of this industry. But of course, litigation is an imperfect tool to address a issue with the scale and complexity of the climate crisis. And what we really want to see is policy. As I hope that you're hearing throughout your Climate Week experience, we need more and better climate action on food systems. We will not reach our goals unless we really seriously focus on bringing down food system emissions. And for those who are familiar with this issue will know, animal agriculture is the lion's share of agricultural emissions. So taking this country, for example, nearly 80% of agricultural emissions in this country come from raising animals for food or raising the feed that we feed to animals for food. So it's a massive issue. Yale Climate Week is an international summit moving toward climate action, and the focus of this Yale Climate Week is on transformative and scalable solutions. And we chose this topic because there are policy solutions here. There are policy wins to be had in the area of climate and animal agriculture. And what we need is we need more folks learning about these issues and working on these issues. So we're really pleased to have this platform. We are going to start today discussing the lack of policy around climate and animal agriculture at the U.S. federal level, and then talk a little bit about what we're starting to see emerging movement at the state and local level in the United States. And then we'll turn to some hopeful news from Denmark. Denmark is the country that is really leading on the global stage on this issue. Each of our three panelists will start with some key points. I'll then ask a couple of questions, but then please be thinking throughout about what your questions are, because we promise we'll have time at the end for those questions. Our first panelist is Peter Lehner. He leads Earthjustice's Sustainable Food and Farming Program. He's a leading expert on climate and agriculture and previously served as the executive director of the Natural Resources Defense Council and as the chief of the Environmental Protection Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's office. Peter teaches a very popular class on food systems and environmental law at Yale Law School. And he will set the stage for us on climate and animal agriculture and what role this industry plays in the climate crisis, and then describe the federal landscape. Thank you.
Thanks. Great to be here. I'm going to talk about the problem and hint at the solution, which will then go into a little more. Roughly speaking, how do I move the slides?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Roughly speaking, agriculture is an important part of the problem because it's a big part of the problem. It's often thought to be somewhat inconsequential, but in fact, agriculture and food system drives anywhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of climate change. I say there's a range because how you measure it, what you include, can be very complicated. But bottom line is it's very significant. You can't figure out a solution until you know where it comes from. So where does this come from? Unlike in most areas where climate change is driven by the burning of fossil fuels and the release of carbon dioxide, in agriculture it's a little more complicated. It's cows belching. It's manure festering in a lagoon. It's the land use, the billions, literally billions of acres that have been transformed from forests and native grasslands into virtually carbonless soil for agriculture or for grazing that drives the climate change. I summarize it as saying it's cows, corn, and crap. So that is what agriculture's contribution to climate change. And if you take a look at this Bloomberg map of land use in the United States, you can see how significant the land element of that is. Even other activities like mining or the refinery across the river of Exxon look big and dirty, but they really don't use much land. What uses land is agriculture, and the vast majority of that is animal agriculture. That huge box is cows grazing. And one of the other huge one is animal feed, which is a very inefficient way to create food for humans. Politically, it's also important, though, that climate change puts agriculture at risk. It's also bad for us in terms of food security and our health and everything else. But it does mean that the farmers who might be resistant to being part of the solution if they're just the problem are also recognizing that they are also the victims. They're on the front line of being affected by climate change. I run some farms in Central America, and I can see this firsthand. Anybody who is running a farm sees this. It's changed weather patterns, changed pest patterns, extreme weather, you name it, farms are seeing it. So that encourages farmers and their communities to be a part of the solution. So what can we do? The good news is there's actually a lot of things that can be done on agriculture. Different ways of growing food, of raising animals, different ways of using our land. The challenge is that it's only, in the US, for example, on maybe 3 or 5% of agricultural land. So our challenge from a policy perspective is how do you accelerate adoption of that? And that's where policy comes into effect. There's a lot of different opportunities there. Some of it is what I think of as my beloved environmental laws. I've spent a lot of time over the years litigating under the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, and they are terrific statutes. They have cleaned up a lot of messes in this country and around the world. Well, not the US laws around the world, but their equivalents. However, they don't really work very well for agriculture. So if we can use these proven tools and have them address some of these agricultural pollution, we can make a big difference. I showed you that map of land. A lot of that land is actually federally owned and managed. We can manage federal land far better than we do right now. Right now, it is very poorly managed for conservation, with the result that I think the last study showed well over half of it is considered significantly degraded. Agriculture is different than many other things because there's something called the Farm Bill, which in today's world has been significantly changed, but for a long time, it would be reauthorized every 5 years and basically pays farmers. Right now, it often pays farmers to use practices that are actually destructive. We can change that, though, to pay farmers for better practices, for conservation practices, for climate-friendly practices. We have the money, let's give it to the same people, but with slightly different incentives attached to it. But it's not only how we grow our food, it's also what we do with our land. Right now, we waste an area the size of Indiana and Illinois combined, every inch of those two very big states, for biofuels, to grow corn and soy that goes into your gas tank, which is actually worse for the climate than petroleum. That's just a stupid use of land. We also waste 40% of the food we produce. That's pretty stupid use of our resources. We also, as I mentioned earlier, use a lot of it in animal agriculture, which is very inefficient. It takes 15 pounds of grain to get a pound of beef. So all of these opportunities, not only how we grow food and how we raise our livestock, but also what we do with our land, what we do with our food, what we do with our agricultural resources. So I've tried to put it all together in this one sort of slide here, where on that side left are the emissions. And one thing to point out is you see animals and feed is a big part of it, and land use is a big part. And land use is almost entirely animals. So roughly speaking from this, and this is worldwide, you can see that well over half, about 60 or 70%, of the agriculture's contribution, the food system's contribution, is animal agriculture. And how do we get there? We grow food better. That's the first two boxes. We also sure we use our land efficiently. Don't waste land and use it efficiently so we don't have to destroy more forest. Shifting diets, as we'll talk about much more, study after study after study has proven to be a very, very powerful tool. And the question is, can we do this without it being a political hot potato, as it were? And Rune Christopher will talk about that. But we also need research. This is an area that hasn't gotten enough attention, and so that's with the big question mark. Unfortunately, federal agriculture research in this country has been cut over recent years. and the proposals are to cut it even further now, and we should all be pushing back because, frankly, there's a lot of things we don't know. There's a lot we do and more that we don't. So that's the solution, we hope.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Great. We're going to move now to Laura Fox, who is my colleague in the Climate Change and Animal Agriculture Litigation Initiative. Laura has deep experience in using legal tools to address the many externalized harms of the industrial animal agriculture system and has worked on everything from environmental injustice to animal suffering. Laura previously directed the Farmed Animal Advocacy Clinic at Vermont Law and Graduate School and also worked for many years as a staff attorney at the Humane Society of the United States. Laura is going to describe, so we heard from Peter about some of the solutions that could be available if we would transform federal policy on this issue in the United States. The reality is right now is that there's an absence of policy on climate and animal agriculture at the federal level in the United States. Laura is going to take us through the emerging landscape at the state and local level. So Laura.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And Peter, thanks for the great, powerful overview of how industrial animal agriculture is driving climate change and highlighting that the federal landscape is so barren in this space. So with, no real federal regulation in sight, we desperately need state and local action. And fortunately, it's this button? Oh, no. Oh, okay. We are seeing some movement at the state and local level. So the first sort of category of regulations that I'd like to highlight involve monitoring and reporting of greenhouse gases, usually from concentrated animal feeding operations or CAFOs. And while data collection doesn't seem super significant, it's really important here because we can't regulate, what we haven't measured or we don't know. And there's lots of knowledge gaps in this space. We don't know exactly where CAFOs are, how many animals are in those CAFOs. And so when we're trying to estimate emissions, it becomes tricky without real numbers and can distort our understanding and leads to gross underestimates. So New York is really leading the charge here. The Department of Environmental Conservation is finalizing a rule that will require large animal or agricultural sources to report greenhouse gas emissions. This specifically is from liquid manure storage and fertilizer use, but there's pressure, mostly from Peter's team at Earth Justice and others, to encourage the department to expand that to include enteric methane and emissions from manure spreading, not just storage. We're also hoping to see monitoring and reporting regulations out of Minnesota through our work with the Climate Change and Animal Agriculture Litigation Initiative at Yale Law School. We had an opportunity to comment with the state's pollution control agency to try and urge them to require emissions monitoring and reporting from large animal feedlots. Reporting goes a long way as well in terms of financial disclosures. So where, we've seen the SEC back away from climate disclosures at the federal level, California is stepping in and, requiring climate disclosures for large companies. There's lots of litigation in this space, but it's not been derailed yet. And so companies need to be prepared to disclose their climate pollution regarding scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2026, and their scope 3 emissions by 2027. There's a companion law as well, focused on those companies as well as a little smaller companies disclosing climate-related financial risks. And there are lots of agricultural companies that would meet the thresholds in order that would trigger these disclosures. And all of this information, the reporting, the monitoring, the financial disclosures related to risk and emissions will help to understand the problem better, develop solutions, and track emissions reductions in this space. Many states, right, have set out targets for reducing emissions. Some have also included specific targets for methane reduction. So California being one, setting a target to reduce methane by 40% by 2030 on a 2013 baseline. And as part of trying to reach those goals, the state is incentivizing alternative manure management. So like solids separation and composting, right? It's really liquid manure storage that produces a ton of methane. So these alternative manure management practices can help to lessen emissions. Unfortunately, they're also highly subsidizing and promoting manure-based biofuels, which only sort of further entrenches the systems that we're trying to steer away from. And it creates a perverse kind of motivation to grow production. And so other states, are leaning towards getting out of supporting those systems. So New York is offering regenerative agriculture guidance to farmers. So while they're not mandating regenerative agricultural practices be utilized, they're providing technical support that can help shift practices over time. I also think it's important to call attention to animal welfare regulations that play a role. Many states have banned extreme confinement practices, like gestation crates and veal crates, battery cages, and these can lead to improved animal welfare, which decreases stress, which can have emissions outcomes. And so looking at it from a more holistic One Health perspective, these types of regulations can be solutions to mitigate emissions in this space. We're also seeing limits on growth, so discussions about moratoriums on CAFOs at both the state and local level. Localities can play a huge role, especially right in regulating, zoning, permitting of facilities that are within their jurisdiction, if they're given permission to and not preempted, right? Or, right, if they have huge purchasing power. So we see in New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, really promoting plant-forward procurement policies, which can help provide lower emission food choices, right? So there's a lot, right? A promising policy is happening, but there's, the other side of the coin where we need to be mindful of false solutions. We need to reevaluate all of these policies and strategies that they're implemented to see if there's more harm being done, like is the case with manure-based biofuels. And then there's tons of challenges in getting these implemented in the states that I've outlined, but also, replicating them elsewhere. So I really look forward to hearing from our next speaker about, what's happening in Denmark and getting inspired and seeing what might be applicable here. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. So, yes, thank you. So, you got an applause line. To sum up, what we've heard so far is we will not reach our climate goals without dealing with the food system. The vast majority of agricultural emissions are from animal agriculture. And then when we look at the U.S. landscape of policy, we see very little activity at the federal level, and we see the beginnings of activity at the state level, some disclosures. We don't even know really what these emissions are yet, and the beginnings of policies, some that we view as positive and some that we view as entrenching the current system, which is bad for the climate and bad for communities and bad for animals. So to be honest, the current U.S. landscape in this area is a bit grim. That may be a theme of your Climate Week so far. It certainly has been of mine. But so for that reason, we're very pleased that we're joined by our colleague Rune Christopher Dragsdahl from Denmark. Rune Christopher is the executive director of the Vegetarian Society of Denmark. He joined that organization as its second employee in 2016, and he has been the lead on the inspiring coalition building and policy change that has the world paying attention. Vox named Rune Christopher as one of its 2024 Future Perfect Leaders, describing how he, quote, got the country to launch an impressive vegetarian experiment. And keep in mind, this is Denmark, which recently, and maybe still now, has more pigs than people. So this is not a light lift. So please, Rune Christopher, tell us what you've done and how you did it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and for inviting me here. Really a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I would like to really insist on the first thing you're saying, because you might think, okay, Denmark, fairy tale story, this is not the US, how can this ever be realistic or relevant for us? But Denmark has the largest number of animals, production animals per capita in the world. And we have a powerful, powerful livestock lobby. So that's why I'm insisting if this can happen in Denmark, it should be possible to happen in other countries. But maybe there will be different mechanisms, but hopefully some learnings could be relevant, and I hope it can inspire a conversation regarding that. So so Denmark launched this action plan for plant-based foods a few years ago. It was part of a broad compromise agreement between multiple parties. And that's another first important point here. The larger deal was made back 4 years ago in 2021. It was with all the parties in the parliament mostly. It included much more funding for the livestock sector, for industrial livestock. But as part of that compromise, the more progressive parties managed to also insert substantial funding for plant-based foods and the decision that Denmark should launch a national action plan for plant-based foods. I think that's the first learning. You need green voices also to compromise. You might need to get your hands dirty as part of a compromise to then get something that can get you started on a journey to something better. So later it was published with the current Minister of Food and Agriculture, who is a conventional farmer from the Farmers' Party. So everything written here, that's a quote from a minister who is from the Farmers' Party, a conventional farmer from a right-wing party. So it says plant-based foods are the future. And it lists lots of challenges: climate change, war in Ukraine, clean water, nature, biodiversity, nutrition, healthy eating. And then the part I like most, increased production and consumption of plant-based foods is part of the answer to these challenges. So it's not like Denmark has gone vegan or is claiming, I think a vegetarian experiment is an exaggeration by Vox, but I think the point is we do need basically all countries in the world to recognize that this is part of the solution. More plants. And that's another key learning from Denmark. We've been trying to talk about more plants and not so much about less meat or less livestock. We focus on what we want more of. And hopefully we'll get that by doing that. So together with this, there's this fund, the Plant-Based Food Grant. And that's another key point in Denmark here. The government is launching this action plan, which is outlining a lot of things the government would like to do, but there's not really a lot of legal mandatory stuff. Yes, they are doing things on public procurement, guidelines for public kitchens. So something is happening, but it's mostly like, you can say, an encouragement, telling all the ministries, you have to think about how you include this under your ministry. But the core of it is making funding available. So basically all municipalities, research institutions, startups, established companies, NGOs can apply for funding competitively. So the philosophy in Denmark is we provide funding for those who have the good ideas. So funding should at least not be a hindrance to create good plant-based ideas that can have structural impact in Denmark. So it's 170 million euros now. It started with 90 million, then they kept adding more and more funding because applications to this fund was much larger than they expected. And that's really the industry buying into it. It's the farmers buying into it. It's everywhere, really. Approximately half of the funding is going to what I would call innovation, R&D, research, anything from crops to products. The other half is for what I would say education, training chefs, kitchen professionals, training even farmers, So education and innovation are the two key words, I would say here. 50% is earmarked organic plant-based because there are strong synergies. And the fund has been made permanent after 2030. And because of how Danish politics works, this does mean that it's very difficult to erase it because it's part of a compromise between the left and the right wing. So it will really stay after 10 years also. So the fund will support, again, stimulating demand, stimulating supply, and building sectoral bridges. So this is just to show an idea here. Again, the first year there was 8 million euros available. Applications were 3 times larger. Then the next year, funding was increased, but so were applications. And just very recently, and I'm a board member there. We have the right to appoint one, to suggest one board member. So I'm a deputy chair, actually, of the grant. The rest of them, incredibly enough, voted the veggie guy to be the deputy chair. And what we can see, again, large increase in funding, but also large increase in applications. And we can see more and more buy-in from the big structural stakeholders. As they see this is long-term funding, then they become more and more interested in developing solutions and trying to get the funding, of course. Who doesn't want funding? But we also need that buy-in of the main structural stakeholders throughout the food system. I'll just give a few examples of what is Denmark actually spending this money on. So this is one example, a large project on growing lupine and soybean, and then building a value chain of this. Denmark has traditionally not grown soybeans, but we can do it if we work on it. So, but also lupine, is usually just a wasted crop, not used for human consumption, but developing a value chain for that. It has a nice sweet flavor. It can be used for many interesting products. Then getting legumes in the curriculum at the agricultural schools. This could sound so basic, but the truth is most farmer students in Denmark are just getting, a lot of knowledge about meat and animal feed and dairy. So actually getting the legumes on the curriculum, and importantly, into the kitchens of the agricultural schools. And of course, it's not like the young farmers will be force-fed legumes, but I think if they have it at least a few times a month, that will help normalize this among the farmers and create less resistance. Another example, this is a project assisting plant-based SMEs in scaling up. So that's a big technological institute getting funding to offer free facilities, free tech equipment, free advice for 20 startups. Another project is this company, which is, many people have a lot of faith in this one. They're doing, it's 100% organically certified, fermented, but it has, well, the minister I mentioned before, who is a farmer, he said, my father would like this product. And even the Farmers Association have said, wow, this is really good, actually. They are now trying to scale this up, because scaling up fermentation is still a tricky thing. But it's quite popular, even among farmers, this product. So again, Denmark is trying to focus on how can we make some of these processed foods that are not ultra-processed, but that are actually mildly processed, and also to get out of that a bit too exaggerated debate on processing, and saying, certain kinds of processing can actually make the product healthier. Fermentation can make a product healthier and better digested by the body. Another project is, Denmark is exporting 85%. So it's not even if we shifted our own diets, we're still exporting a lot of meat and dairy. So we also need to be able to shift the export markets of Denmark. So that would be, for example, training kitchen professionals in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. They got a grant for that, just for using raw materials. And new education, a green food chef, as an alternative to the old chef education, which is basically French cuisine, lots of meat. But now the alternative is you can also do a green chef education. And the wonderful thing is they can see now they're attracting more students than before. They were actually facing a shortage of young people who didn't want to become a chef. But now they attract people with a different profile by offering this education. So as you can hear, these examples, either of these are not very expensive things to do, but they're deeply structural. As I said, it's the food served at farmer schools. It's how the chefs are being taught. And that will have long-lasting structural impact, I believe. Nudging, of course, I think here, the US, you do have that wonderful frontrunner case with the hospitals in New York City. And also now Sodexo rolling this out at 400 hospitals across the US. So that's something the world should pay attention to. You can achieve so much with nudging, really. But again, professionals need to be taught how to do nudging. You can also do nudging the wrong way, so people actually get angry and feel they're being nudged, being manipulated. So again, training professionals is both about training recipes, but it's also about training menu design, training naming, training the whole architectural choice, choice architecture. Finally, one more example, a plant-powered sport and fitness project. So again, how do we reach those young males who believe they can only build muscles by getting lots of animal protein? So again, reaching out to sports clubs, sports halls, what is actually being served in those places where people are going for fitness and swimming and training. These are just some examples, ranging from tech to education to broader outreach, but really trying to focus this funding on being structural in Denmark. So how did this happen? First keyword is really engaging multiple stakeholders, and just a few examples here. Bridge building agricultural schools. I went to a large school with 300, agricultural college with 300 students 7 years ago. I was in this panel, imagining being there with all these young farmers and their parents, and you're really the lone veggie person in the room, and everyone are expecting you to be the devil in disguise, and not even in disguise, just be the devil. And then instead, actually, you can surprise them by being much more friendly than they anticipated. And one concrete example that I love to, I think it's a good point here, is there was a young farmer saying, I'm studying industrial pig farmer. Do you want me to change? Is that really? Please tell me the truth. Do you want me to change, to study something else? And the tempting answer from many green NGOs would be, yeah, sure, please go ahead. That would be wonderful. But I answered, that's your choice. I'm not going to tell you what to study. I'm not going to tell you what to produce as a farmer. I do think structurally we need more farmers to diversify. We do need more farmers to choose plant proteins. But what you are doing, that is your choice. And we need that bridge building. We need to be brave and also go out in the do some more uncomfortable town halls in Iowa, or I don't know where in the US. We need more people doing that. And I know you will say that's difficult in the US context, but still, that's actually a key point for me. The more you want to change the world, the more it's your responsibility to build the bridges to those people who seem very far away from you. So we managed to build a great relationship with the Danish Farmers Association, the conventional farmers, where they published this report some years ago. So remember, they represent livestock farmers, but they published an R&D strategy for plant-based foods together with the Vegetarian Society of Denmark. Again, because they felt, well, you're vegetarian kind of people, but you seem to be friendly and pragmatic. So again, bridge building is a key here. Finally, we have a great collaboration with the organic farmers. There are many mutual overlaps between the organic and the plant-based movement. And generally, NGOs and plant-based businesses also need to collaborate. In Southern Europe, they're actually a bit scared. The NGOs are really trying to stay away from the industry. That's tricky, because we also need industry. We just need to find the right balance of collaboration and NGO independence. And this brings me to my final slide, I think. Yes. So my 5 key takeaways are, we need to talk about more plants. We have to focus on funding. There has to be actually money to do this. We have to build bridges with compromises, real compromises. And again, the more far we think someone are away from us, the more it is our responsibility to build that very, very long bridge, even though it sounds impossible. Build demand through education also. Not just R&D money, we need educational money. And again, we need both whole foods and convenience foods and technology. That's at least the learnings from Denmark. I'm looking forward to your reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I'm going to ask just a couple of questions and then turn it over to you all in the audience. So please be thinking about what your questions are. And my first question, having heard that very inspiring update from Denmark, is for Laura and Peter sitting here. I'm wondering what you're feeling, probably some jealousy, that this sort of government support for alternatives was achieved in Denmark, that this sort of coalition building was successful across party lines. What are your reactions, and which parts of this might be transferable to the US context?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to be jealous of. And, so when thinking about replicating sort of the successes in Denmark and what you've done, which is just amazing, it's hard to think about these efforts sort of at the federal level in the U.S., occurring in the near term, given sort of political gridlock, entrenched influence of the industry. I don't know that there's enough construction material out there to build a bridge big enough across that political divide, but we'll try. So at the federal level, it's hard to imagine these types of policies being implemented. But states can lead, and many already are. I spoke about California, New York, Minnesota being leaders. They've shown that they have the interest to regulate agricultural emissions, to look at different manure management processes, right? So those seem to be ideal or logical sort of places to start to go further with implementing, an action for plant-based foods. I don't know that we'll ever get to a place where we'll implement, a carbon tax on heads of cattle, but maybe there's some other types of climate pricing mechanisms that states might implement. It's funny you mentioned Iowa because, so I outlined, and there's a map and you can really see where the consolidation of progress is with New York and California. But I was reminded of sort of Iowa maybe being a spot to kind of focus on and target. This is a state that's become the nation's largest producer of pigs. It's gone from having thousands of farms with hundreds of animals to hundreds of farms with thousands of animals, tens of thousands of animals. And the consolidation, I think, has grown into like a disillusionment among farmers who feel sort of trapped by the CAFO model or exploited by the vertically integrated corporations. And at the same time, I think, local communities are becoming more vocal about the discrete environmental impacts that they're facing from these large industrialized operations, especially on the impact of water pollution, nitrate contamination, right? And so there seems to be a citizen sort of power and movement growing in Iowa. And that could create a unique situation in which maybe some of these more progressive policies could be implemented. Now, that said, Iowa is also a place where every year a CAFO moratorium is introduced and fails. And every year they try to instill like a state Clean Water Act, and that fails. So there's so much bridge building to do in all of these different areas and communities. But hopefully, especially as we see the successes and that it's possible and that, there's compromises to be made, more of these policies can be adopted at the state level.
I would just focus on the first 2 points that are on this slide. As somebody at a conference earlier this week pointed out, if you take seriously the notion we're going to have more people, they get richer, they're going to want more meats or things like that, and there's not really a whole bunch more room for more cows. We're going to need more plants, and just to supply that demand, and so farmers are in a good place to supply that need. So speaking of more plants is also both less threatening for eaters, but also it's a business opportunity. The second thing is the focusing on the funding. As I mentioned earlier, there's already a lot of money out there. The federal government in the Farm Bill gives farmers $20 billion plus a year. And right now, as I mentioned, often to encourage unhelpful practices, but they can change that. And interestingly, in the Republican reconciliation budget bill, which in my view was a policy and political and human disaster, there's actually one little good thing in it, which is we got more money for agricultural conservation practices. And that's, I think, the only good thing in an otherwise disastrous bill. But the reason for that is because, just like you pointed out that there's more applications than you have money for, there are 2 or 3 times more applications by farmers for assistance for conservation practices than the federal government can supply. So there was a lot of political pressure to say, hey, give us more money. And the same is going on at the state. New York State gives out $10 or $15 million a year for similar purposes, also vastly oversubscribed. So we have the money, and let's start nudging it into better practices. So great opportunities there.
Great, great. My last question is for you, Runa Christopher. And just like when we were planning this panel, we thought, if there's one person in the world that we could have come talk to us about climate and animal agriculture policy, it was you. And I know that you've been consulting with folks around the world in other countries. Denmark is really recognized as a leader not only in Europe, but also everywhere on this issue. So I'm interested in what other countries are you watching? Are there other positive changes that we can learn from elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think first of all, we have to remember, like, the countries we can really learn from is actually, India, Ethiopia, maybe even Canada has a large lentil and yellow pea production. so there are other places actually to learn from which have a low animal production and a low a diet more aligned with the Eat Lancet's recommendations. But again, among the countries with a high large livestock sector and large meat production, yes, then I do think Denmark is relevant to follow. And what we can see, a few examples emerging that is showing the hope that, yeah, this is not just an isolated case. Very specifically, Portugal has decided they've submitted to the European Union a plan to make a plant-based strategy. And they are formally supporting now Denmark in the call for a European plan for action-based plan. Plant-based action plan. So the Danish government is actually working for this. I incidentally actually kept a bonus slide, which I might move on to. We've launched this thing we're calling Danish plant-based diplomacy, playing on combining the word plant-based. That'll be a red light for some people with diplomacy, which is about diplomacy and bridge building. And it's philanthropically funded for a few years, and then hopefully we can get more after that. But the Farmers Union, the big industry, everyone, Organic Denmark, they're all supporting it, not with money, but with the name and the logos. So we have this website, plantdiplomacy.eu, which is really if they see it as branding the farmers, I don't mind. It's just great to have Danish livestock farmers actively telling other countries, yeah, we think we can also embrace plants. So it's really useful. So we have a high-level guy, innovation director from the Danish Farmers Association, who has been with me in Athens and Brussels. Now he's going to Ireland this week while I'm here, actually. And then he'll be going later this year to Paris and to Madrid. So, they're actively supporting this call at the European level to get their brother, sister organizations across Europe on board. So Portugal, at least, is a case. I have heard rumors that other countries as well are actually really working on this. We've had meetings with government officials from many parts of the world, Chile, Canada. I'm going to Brasilia tomorrow, traveling there, where we have an event at the Danish embassy in Brasilia, where we again bring actually the Farmers Association from Denmark. We are paying their travel. It's kind of funny, right? You're used to farmers supposedly paying others, but in this case, we're not paying them money, but we're paying their flight. And that means we'll have again the Danish farmers talking to the Brazilian counterparts saying, relax, guys, this is part of the future. We can also support this. And I was just told this morning that this is a pretty small event at the Danish embassy in Brasilia, but there will be 17 Brazilian government officials attending, which is really great, because we're trying to see if we can make just some small inroads ahead of the COP30. I'm not naive about this. It will take a long time, big obstacles, north and south, huge differences. But I do think with diplomacy and curiosity, we can get a long way.
Great, thank you. So who has questions for any of the panelists? Great, and I'll come back with the microphone. Oh, good.
I don't need to use the mic. That's fine as well. Rune, Christopher, we connected previously. Oh, it's on now. Perfect. Thank you. We connected previously through a LinkedIn conversation about the GHG livestock emissions tax. Vivek, and now doing my MP at Columbia. I had a question about where will the revenues from that tax, when the first phase starts to get implemented in 2030, I believe, like that progressive increase in the taxation amount, where will it get invested specifically? Because I remember reading that the government was going to invest in green agri-tech areas, but didn't really understand what exactly that would look like. Because you have to create that kind of support, right, for the farmers who do end up shifting to maybe legumes or something like that.
Great question, and thank you for it. And the reason why I'm generally emphasizing the carrot more than the stick. So that means the funding for plant-based rather than the tax, because what did happen, I was at COP29 last year in Azerbaijan, and then they came with the deal they made in Denmark, and I talked to some Global South farming representatives, and they were really concerned about this. They're feeling, oh no, now they're coming for our livestock, for our survival. And then I was saying, yeah, but please also look into the part of the deal about plant-based, where there'll be incentives to develop the plant-based production. Honestly, within Denmark, the carbon tax on livestock is really small. It will have an impact. It might reduce livestock production by 5% or so. That's very little compared to what might need to happen in Denmark. But for the farmers, that's a very fundamental thing, that they have swallowed that compromise to accept that reduction. Because they see once you accept that small reduction, once you accept the principle of a tax, then you're opening the door to a lot of stuff. So I talked to the person from the Danish Farmers Union here the other day, and he's getting a lot of, a lot of shit, from his colleagues from around the world who are saying, why did you accept this tax? So I actually think the most powerful part of the Danish tax is not the impact it'll have in Denmark, but it's the principle that now you have a country doing it and thereby legitimizing and saying, this is true, it's not a hoax, it's part of the issue. We need to deal with it. And the fact, so that we should be grateful for the Danish farmers to accept that, even though within Denmark it is too small to have a real impact. Which also means they'll be paying so little so late that the funding will take quite a few years. The revenue from that will take several years to actually materialize because they'll only start paying it after 5 years. And it will be all going, the idea is that it will be all going back into the same sector. So any livestock generated funding will just go back to R&D for livestock activities. But the point is still, it will still hit those of the livestock farmers who are not at a level where might still shut down some of them. Because it's not all of them who will, those who benefit from it might be those who are already doing well. So it's still going to have an impact, just a too small impact.
That's great. And if anyone doesn't have the background, I think this is the first emissions tax on animals in the world, and it's on cattle, pigs, and sheep, I think, or?
Yeah, I actually don't remember if it's on sheep. We have very few sheep.
Yeah.
It's on cattle and pigs, and then low-lying peatlands, which also emit a lot of carbon.
Yeah, and New Zealand had proposed a tax like this at one point, and then there was a political change, and the proposal was withdrawn. So I think AJ in the back was next.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing your expertise. I think, Laura, my question is for you, because I think you're who mentioned this, but happy to hear from any of you. Specifically about the CAFO moratoriums. Perhaps it's too early to know, but I just personally have my own hesitations about them and would love to hear your thoughts. Perhaps just like with any moratorium, I fear that maybe it will increase the amount of CAFOs until the moratorium happens. I also wonder if we're pushing CAFOs to other places, including abroad. And I guess, is there any data yet showing that it's actually decreasing the amount of animals that we are farming at this point? And I guess just to piggyback on Runa Christopher, this is kind of a stick policy instead of a carrot. But yeah, would love to hear any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think you're right. So, North Carolina sort of led the charge with CAFO moratoriums in like 1997 after a series of hurricanes flooded a number of hog CAFOs on the coast with large poo lagoons, right, that then overflowed and created lots of discharges and pollution. And so they entered a permanent moratorium that then got whittled away, right? And so then later they've made carve-outs for hog CAFOs that have biodigesters, right? And they're one of the states that mandate a certain amount of their energy has to come from manure-based biofuels. And then there's also, no moratoriums on other CAFOs like poultry and stuff like that, right? Other places that have sort of, I guess, tried moratoriums have done it on a temporary basis to study them and slow them down, and those then sort of expire and haven't done anything as far as I'm aware, right? It just goes back to business as usual. And I think a lot of the sort of then the wins that are happening, or if you can call them wins of moratoriums, are local ones that aren't preempted by the state. But that creates a NIMBY effect, right? Where if you're politically powerful, you're able to shut down, right, in that location, these facilities, but they will be placed successfully somewhere else, right? So I think I highlighted it as a policy solution at the state level. There was no judgment on which ones were most effective or not. It's just what states are trying. And so I think it's worth looking at it more closely to see what the actual effects are of those moratoriums.
If I can add, there is a complicating factor here, and which really drives the importance of the demand side. Because if you're going to produce a lot of beef or pork or whatever, in many ways, as disgusting as I find them, CAFOs have certain efficiencies. So for example, and I don't like saying this, but it's true, grass-fed beef, because they live longer, they graze longer, they belch longer, in many ways have a higher carbon footprint than a cow finished in a feedlot. And for example, beef raised in the US has a lower carbon footprint than beef raised in Brazil or in other parts of the world. So it gets complicated if you simply say, well, we want to stop a CAFO in, say, North Carolina. Iowa becomes the largest. It's sort of like a balloon. And North Carolina, Iowa, it's probably not that different. But if we stop it here and it goes to Brazil, it would probably be a lot of deforestation. All of this leads to saying we need to really fix how we are producing the food, and we really need to think about the demand side. And that's where what is happening in Brunei Christopher, and recognizing it's not either or, it's both. And that is too often the conversation is as if it's either or, but it's really both. And that's the way it is with energy. We both are trying to use energy more efficiently and switch to renewable energy. So we want to think about the same here.
Great, thank you. I think Thais was next here, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the insightful conversation. Thank you for the speakers. I have one question for Ron Christopher. So I was just wondering if you could share a little bit more about what were the key entry points that enabled the political support for the tax in Denmark, because I think we are always seeking for the low-hanging fruit and the things that resonate more with people, like water quality and health and things like that. So I just wondered, like, what do you think that was helpful to have the political support?
So I think it matters that Denmark likes to see itself as a green country and was early on wind energy. But then the whole agricultural discussion was really trying to be kept at bay and not really go deeply into that for many years. But then as Denmark increased its climate targets, there's a 70% emissions reduction target for Denmark for 2030. So initially when they set that target, they said they were really fighting against it, the big parties, saying we don't know how to get to 70%. And that's basically because they said we know how to get to 55, maybe 60%. And the truth is you can of course get from 60 to 70, but I and others were knowing that then you have to deal with the livestock sector. That's where this starts entering the conversation. But then they accepted the 70% target by saying we don't know how to get there. Then later on, eventually, there's still, as I said, the actual carbon taxes on the livestock is lower per ton than it is on the industry. So actually the industry in Denmark is a bit frustrated because they're saying we're generating much more revenue and money and jobs and exports than the agricultural sector, but we're being taxed higher. But again, there for political reasons, rural city balances, etc., and specific party political considerations, it's being kept lower. But eventually it was accepted as a, because the farmers were in the room, because the farmers accepted it, and that was because there was pressure on the farmers they were saying basically it will come in some shape. There were some party dynamics actually between, that's maybe the advantage sometimes of multi-party systems, that there were some parties competing over votes and a right-wing farmers' party that needed to get some city voters to vote for them also. So they had to accept it, while their usual constituencies are more in the rural areas. So it was a delicate balance for them, and they've lost some voters to a party now more to the right wing than them, which are criticizing the carbon tax. So the dynamics are delicate, I would say. But ultimately, because the farmers were on board, because I guess Denmark they see it as an innovation opportunity also. And honestly, I'm also feeling that maybe I'm naive or too hopeful, but I feel that it has maybe been helpful that we did establish the plant-based food grant and the plant-based action plan some years before the carbon tax. So we opened up a constructive conversation around more plants that has given at least farmers, some of the younger farmers, some years to think about, there's another kind of farming. So maybe that has played at least a small role in making that there are more farmers out there who accept that they could be producing something else, and thereby among the farmers making it a little more balanced who is for and against, maybe. But the farmers being on board is crucial for the government to actually act on it.
And if I can, just one thing, for people living in the city, here we all are in New York City, you think farmers and it's monolithic. There are actually many different constituents there. And actually people who are, for example, working farms are very different than, for example, JBS and Tyson, the world's largest meat companies, who buy from the farmers. And they may have very different economic and political interests, which may be different from, which often are different from, for example, the people who work on the farms or the people who live nearby the farms. So one opportunity we have as we think about this is to recognize there is not one massive monolithic farm interest. Down in Washington, frankly, there is the American Farm Bureau Federation is a very powerful voice for sure, but there are other voices that are often quite different and have very different views of plants, have different views of land use, different views of climate change reality and water pollution. And I think part of the opportunity is to, using your phrase, build bridges with those other parts of the farm community and the farm lobby, other than just the most, which is usually the agro-industry companies like the JBS, Tyson, Monsantos of the world.
Yes, I think over here we had a question. Yeah.
I have a lot of questions, but I think I'm going to ask. Hi, I'm going to ask you something that I think applies to you and to all of you, really. And you, Peter, alluded to it, which is that consumer demand is very important. And I'm really wondering whether there's been any material change in what people want to eat that you see either as a result, for instance, of your compromise, and I'm very curious what you gave up, by the way, because you said compromise, but also, here in the United States, where, what's changed, if anything, and what do you expect can change and how?
So I think from the plant-based side, part of the compromise is like, you need lots of vegans and vegetarians to recognize that livestock is also a part of the world, and that you cannot have an all or nothing approach to this. Like, there is a balanced number of livestock that can be sustainable. That in itself is a compromise for many people who have the idea that we have to eliminate livestock from the system for ideological reasons. So just entering that point where we actually have a scientific approach in itself, and accepting that you may personally want to eliminate all CAFOs and livestock, but you might have to strike a compromise where you just are happy if you can actually achieve a 20% reduction, for example. And that's even though scientists would say we need a much larger reduction. But the other question you're saying, demand side, very important. What is happening? Honestly, private consumption is very, very difficult to move, and you can see that across many countries. Institutional consumption, a lot can happen, and that has to do with the fact that if you have professionals who serve delicious dishes, people will eat what is being served. And the default, people have been used for meat being the default, but if you make it plant-based the default, normally you have to ask for plant-based, but now, like Sodexo's approaches, you have to ask for meat, and that in itself swaps around 50% of the demand. So that I think is a powerful tool to be realistic about that. But one thing, a key point I do want to say is, and that goes against to the whole core of Eat Lancet 2.0 will come out soon. Eat Lancet 1.0 was like 300 grams of meat per week. Earlier this year, Danish scientists came with another calculation saying we have to go down to 250 grams of meat per week. So I wonder what Eat Lancet 2.0 will say. I actually got concerned when I heard that number in the press, and I felt, oh no, now we'll just have people start hating the scientists for saying this. So I went on national television. I got the chance to come with a message saying, guys, please remember 250 grams is an average. There will always be a normal distribution of diets. So if you really, really love meat, then you have to support that other people get access to eat much more plants. It's a mathematical truth.
So we're almost, sorry. We're almost out of time. I think, Peter, do you have a very quick response there? And then we're going to take our last question in the middle over here. Who's have your hand
Sure,
up?
just note that we tend to think that our diets at any moment is what it is. But if we just think back 10 years, the balance between beef and chicken was very different, between different types of vegetables and starches and grains was very different. Obviously, the sort of whatever junk food, processed food. So our diet has already changed, and every 10 years it's already changing a lot. So I think that is only to be open to the idea that diets are not fixed monolithic things that never change. They're always changing. And this can be part of the conversation to change, nudging it along.
Great, thank you. Our last question there in the middle.
Bringing back a little bit to the U.S. focus, and earlier in the conversation we were talking more about government policy at the federal level and state level, and trying to make sure that farmers can continue to be supported to do more practices on the land that are better for the planet, for climate, and for human health. I'm wondering, currently, there's like a massive farm financial crisis that's brewing in the U.S. Maybe a third of all farmers will go bankrupt in the next couple months unless they get a bailout, which they probably will from USDA. So I'm curious to hear from Peter and Laura what you guys think about, as a federal bailout comes that may most likely privilege the larger, more entrenched, more industrial producers, and as also federal funding has been scraped back from supporting smaller scale producers who are trying to do more regenerative livestock, rotational grazing, those kinds of things, which are more in a relationship with the land. What is the roadmap to fight for the rights of these smaller producers who are trying to do better things to keep, like, obviously we still have a huge market for animals in this country. In the short term, how do we deal with the crisis of right now?
So one of the interesting things is, as I mentioned earlier, you have money and the possibility of adding certain strings to that. And that concept is not entirely foreign. There's parts of the Farm Bill that require farmers, for example, not to fill wetlands or or have too much soil erosion if they want to get their money. And interestingly, that actually polls pretty well in farm country because it's not a crazy idea. If I take taxpayer money, I shouldn't be poisoning my neighbor. It also is actually part of Project 2025, a conservative manifesto. So the idea of saying, look, we've got a financial problem in farm countries, so we're going to come in and financially support, and we're going to ask farmers, as part of that, to do things that are good for all of us, is not a crazy concept. It is one that gets a lot of support. Now, I don't know, politics today are just, weird. So who knows? But it is interesting that that is a concept that is both conservative support and farm support, so could be expanded in the future.
And I will just add, that's a complicated question. I do not have a solution, but I encourage you to turn to your right, and there's a woman, Jessica, next to you, who I think will have some really great ideas. So just to spark conversations after.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here with us. This was great. And let's give a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.